Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron is up this week. And we've got a very special episode today. So, Aaron, why don't you kick it off and tell us what's happening today?
Great. Well, I'm bringing a documentary called The Alabama Solution to the table today. But before we get into that, we also have a very special guest on the podcast today. We are incredibly honored to be joined today by Dakarai Larriett. Welcome, Dakarai. Dakarai is running.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So Dakarai is running to be the Democratic candidate for United States Senate to represent Alabama. So before we get into the documentary that we're going to talk about today, we'd love to have you introduce yourself to our listeners. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, thanks so much again, Aaron and Damien, for having me. I'm Dakarai Larriett, born and raised Alabamian, but I've lived all over the place, mostly due to my father's military service, but also study abroad. And we were just chatting a little bit earlier that I spent a semester in College Park. So we had that in common. And as mentioned, I am running for United States down here in Alabama on a platform of people-centric policies. And when I say I'm running for all Alabamans, that includes those incarcerated or impacted by incarceration. And my whole experience with false arrest last year really opened my eyes to the criminal justice challenges we have throughout this nation. And I even wrote a book about it called Don't Flush.
Yeah, amazing. So the wrongful arrest really kind of kicked off this impetus to get involved politically.
Yes, I would say that was the spark, but it's built upon a foundation of 20 years of public service. So from advocating for homeless and LGBT youth in the South Bronx shortly after I moved there after college, to working in harm reduction for the National Harm Reduction Coalition. And then most recently back in Alabama, I joined the board of University of Alabama Alumni Association, ensuring everyone has cost-effective access to education.
All right.
That's
amazing.
Incredible. Well, thank you again so much for being here. We're so excited to have this conversation with you today.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's get into the documentary, if that works. So The Alabama Solution is a documentary recently released on HBO. It's really powerful. It's a story about the really awful conditions that exist in the prison system, specifically in Alabama. They had overcrowding. The documentary talks about how they had overcrowding of 200% overcapacity, and they were also understaffed and only having a third of the staff that they needed. And you can see throughout the documentary these really awful conditions. There were rodents everywhere. There's filth not being cleaned up, garbage not being picked up, and just really terrible things going on. People ODing because there weren't enough people around to help manage drug use and also contraband getting into the system itself being its own issue. So all of that going on. There's a lot in this documentary. Yeah. But I'm curious about your reaction, Dakarai. What stood out to you? And you also suggested that we talk about this today. So anything you want to add and get us started.
Well, as part of my kind of 67 county listening tour, I've been listening to people throughout the state. And I actually learned that the documentary was being made many months ago through discussions with Alabama Advocacy. So they're an advocacy group for largely folks who've been in the system for 20, 30 years. They're senior citizens at this point, and they really should at this point be given parole or release. And what we saw in the documentary is basically impossible to get out of this system once you're in. Yeah. And from them, I was invited to attend a hearing at the Alabama State House. So you saw some things from a hearing in the past in the documentary. Well, I attended one of those sessions and then was invited to speak. And I spoke about my experience of false arrests and broken criminal justice system where I have still not gotten justice, and I don't want that to happen to Alabama. And that was ultimately how I really learned about the documentary, met families impacted. I sat next to a man whose son was murdered in a prison system. So it's very deeply personal to me, and realized that these facilities are just a short drive away from my home was so upsetting. And even if you can't, I guess, feel it emotionally, I tell people, like, financially, you're being robbed as a taxpayer when we've spent $57 defending corrections officers for torturing incarcerated people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
absolutely.
So much of that is all wrapped up in this. So thank you.
It's fascinating sort of hearing your perspective alongside what we learned in the documentary. And for me, it was, and I had mentioned this to Aaron several times, it was gut-wrenching and jarring to sort of watch the film and to really get a picture of a firsthand account, really, of what's happening in the prison system across the state, and all the things that Aaron mentioned, like the rat-infested and overcrowded living quarters, the flooding in the hallways, to see inmates being beat by guards and leaving in body bags, and there was also some attention paid to the fact that some of these facilities are supposed to have a rehabilitation focus, right? And those programs just don't exist, in the facilities. And so for me, it was difficult to bear witness to all of that, but it also was telling, I think, of how important it is that a documentary like this exists, that people have a chance to sort of see what's going on inside those walls and, to see the inhumanity of it all and hopefully spark change, and that folks on the outside can be working alongside the incarcerated organizers. We got to meet and know more about their story in this film, and hopefully inspire change. And I think for me and for us and what we talk about in this podcast, I mean, that's abolition. That's really where we need to go is abolishing these systems. And one of the other things that stood out to me that I'll mention and I'll stop talking is there was a stat mentioned, you mentioned a couple of stats, but there was one about it has the state prison system has the highest overdose rate, the highest murder rate, and the highest suicide rate in the country. And that was just unconscionable. And I don't know if you've heard more about that.
Yeah, so just last year alone, 277 people died in our prison system, and the main reasons are murder, suicide, and drug overdose. So these are not places of rehabilitation, and named very incorrectly Alabama Department of Corrections, and drugs are being introduced by the corrections officers. They can triple their salary when they do so.
Yeah.
And then we get people locked into this system where they're providing below-cost labor to agribusiness throughout the state, fast food restaurants, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels a lot like slavery. In fact, I just finished reading Black AF history. Something like 70% of the Alabama economy was driven by leasing of incarcerated people at the turn of the century Reconstruction. So it seems like we're doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, these systems have a way of evolving and changing in the background as it looks like on the surface we're making some progress. It's underneath it. It's just a different way to do the same thing is kind of how it feels as you look through the history of all that, right?
Right.
One of the things that I thought was, I don't know the word, fascinating, I guess. Fascinating is not the right word, but infuriating was the cell phone problem, quote unquote, where cell phones were being brought into the prison system by guards. As you mentioned with drugs, there's a lot of contraband moving into the system through the corrections officers. And Robert Earl says that they focus more on the phones instead of the incidents that were recorded with the phones. And Robert Earl is one of the activists who appears in the documentary. And it's just a perfect encapsulation of what we know about how prisons seem to run across the country, is that they're focusing on this minor violation of, prisoners shouldn't have phones, and that being the public thing, and that being the problem, is that,
right,
prisoners have phones, they shouldn't have phones. This is a scourge of the system. It's like, well, but they're recording these awful conditions. And isn't that actually the problem? And just the sort of the cover up and the sweeping things under the rug to say, oh, well, the problem is the phones, and it's not. And that just feels like such a perfect encapsulation of how these things operate.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we see it in our policing system as well. When I think about my false arrest, the most infuriating thing for me, like after many months later, was seeing that my case was dismissed for qualified immunity, and the judge ruled that I was suspicious for driving at 3 a.m. So forget about the attempted drug planting, forget about the torture, forget about the malicious prosecution. I was driving at 3 a.m. and I was accused of making a rolling stop. So everything else that happened that night doesn't matter.
Yeah. And I just saw something today about I think the AP just reported on a surveillance program that ICE is doing where they're hiding surveillance cameras in traffic cones and traffic barrels, those big orange barrels on the highway,
Oh, wow.
and tracking license plates to check for suspicious activity. So they're looking at people, they're looking at all of our driving habits and trying to track, okay, you're traveling at times we deem suspicious, or you're going down roads that we deem suspicious, and then alerting local law enforcement to that behavior to then have you get pulled over for rolling through a stop sign or some other minor thing that could potentially, they're trying to gather intelligence from us in that way. And so, yeah, it ties into like so many things. We're seeing this on the federal levels too, as the Trump administration really ramps up their ICE immigration raids and attempts to really surveil all of us even more than already happens.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. 1984.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things I'll mention, you mentioned the word cover up. And so it brought me to the story that we learn in this film. I think one of the major focuses of this documentary is on an inmate named Stephen Davis. And he was beaten to death by 3 guards while he was in prison. And his murder was covered up by the prison system and ultimately by the state as well. And we see in the film that his family hires this civil rights lawyer. His name was Hank Sherrod. And we get to see him put together his investigation. He investigates the circumstances of Stephen's murder. He sets up calls with inmates to find out what happened and hopefully get enough of them to sort of corroborate what happened. And he gets quite a few of them to do that, which was great. But the exception, the holdout, was his cellmate, James Sales, who kind of just declines to say anything to Hank. I think at one point he says, "I'll tell his mama, when I get out, but I'm not going to talk to you now." And we see that that's because, the prison's investigative unit got to him and it intimidated him into sort of staying quiet. And that stood out to me for lots of reasons. It's horrifying. It's upsetting, that this man was beaten to death. But we learned that over the course of a 5-year period, and Dakarai, I think you mentioned this, the state has spent $53 million defending its prison system. And so that's settling lawsuits and protecting officers that are accused of misconduct. And the only thing that it made me think about was just how better that funding could be spent, how many other things that funding in the state of Alabama could be spent on. I mean, education, social services, healthcare. I mean, the list of life-affirming services, is endless. But instead, we're using it to sort of to cover up the injustice that's happening here. And Melvin Ray is another incarcerated organizer that's featured in this film, and he said something to the effect of, "Because there is no regard for our lives, there are no consequences for their actions." And he's talking about the system and the guards, and none of that should be okay.
And the really infuriating thing is it's not like that $57 million is going to families as restitution. It's going to lawyers. They're not really paying out much of anything. And you saw Steve Marshall, the attorney general, who thinks that everything's fine. He's my Senate opponent, actually, on the Republican side.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow. You can't make this up.
Nope.
You can't make this up.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we are not safer for these actions, right? You have people who shouldn't be in the system that are stuck in the system, working for free, providing slave labor. The jails are being overcrowded. And what happens is you have people who need to be there that are with nonviolent first-time offenders or senior citizens that really should be released at this point. We're paying for that. And there's this inflection point because of the overcrowding where you have the murders because it's so highly indexed, right? So we see that folks like teenagers who made a mistake get murdered when they're on their way out the door. There's this jealousy that happens in this inflection point. So I don't think that the 3 mega prisons are going to make things any better. In fact, what I'm hearing from my intelligence is that the number of beds, the absolute number of beds, once they consolidate everything, will be about the same. So you're going to have even more consolidation of violent offenders and first-time nonviolent offenders.
Yeah, and one of the things that reminds me of is I think they said that in the film, that in a press conference, somebody asked. So the number of beds ultimately is not going to change, but at the end of the film too, they talk about how much money this is going to cost. And initially, I think it was $100 million something, and now one prison has at least tripled, and so this is going to cost at least almost $1 billion for 3 new mega prisons. And a lot of that money, at least initially, was borrowed. Kay Ivey said they're going to take it from the education budget, which I think in a lot of ways, in so many ways, that's just mortgaging your future to try to put a Band-Aid on an issue that exists right now, because those things like education and healthcare and housing are all proven methods of reducing your so-called crime rate, right? And to say, oh, well, we're going to underfund education to increase the funding for prisons, you're just demonstrating this warped sense of priorities that I think has really demonstrated how much the Republican Party and a lot of elected officials are just out of touch with what people actually need.
Right. Yeah, I think the price tag is now over $1 billion for one of those prisons. And we are rating our education trust fund to build it. There's a delay, which means that once they start construction again, it's going to be even more expensive. So it's a real boondoggle. And that's really, my plan is we've got to have a legislative review of the whole process end to end. The lawyers that are getting rich off of this whole process, and the defense, the corrections officers, who's building these prisons, what are their ties politically, the agribusiness, the fast food restaurants, everyone who's participating in the leasing of labor. That's going to be really interesting to untie. And I really want to bring on a civilian oversight board comprised of those families. So the families you see in the documentary, the families I met at the State House, they should be in a board level position to oversee and investigate issues and hold the Department of Corrections accountable.
That's incredible. Yeah. I was going to ask a little bit about your perspective and what your platform was as regards to all this. So thank you so much for sharing that. You mentioned the board, and it made me think about one of the things we got to see in this documentary was the study group that KIV formed and convened and the focus of it was to examine the issues of injustice and inhumane treatment of inmates within the prison system. And I think this came up after Stephen Davis's death. And so the chairman of this study group, his name was Justice Champ Lyons. I just wanted to share how he opened the public hearing of this study group, because it was, you said the word fascinating earlier, not the right word. I'm quoting him here. He goes, "Now, of course, the way to assure absolute and total protection of the public upon conviction of a crime would be execution of all who are convicted. However, conscience and the limits of the U.S. Constitution do not tolerate such extreme consequence of wrongdoing. So we live with the reality that most of those who are convicted of crime will someday again walk the streets." And there were, I think, several moments throughout the documentary where I thought about how, prison reform and certainly abolition has got to be an uphill battle in Alabama. Even some of the folks who are featured in the documentary, as they're talking, I think Stephen Davis's mom and relatives are talking to random folks throughout, and just the hearing the ways they talked about, well, what did he do? The questions that they asked. So I pinned that, but to hear that from the man who, and I'm checking my notes again, who said that the study group was formed to examine the injustices and inhumane treatment of inmates within the prison system, to then open the public hearing with that we should really just execute them all. I think it was so jarring, and it was hard to think about, if you're starting from a place with that mindset, where can you really go from there?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many low-hanging fruit that we can address. For example, we have permitless concealed carry throughout the state, which has resulted in increased gun violence. The economic piece, the underfunding of education, the lack of economic opportunity. These are kind of investments that we refuse to make as a state. And then you can say, hey, I'm building this prison. That's very visual for people, and they think that that's going to keep them safe.
Yeah, there's so many ways the prison and policing system is sold to us as a public of this is what we can do to keep you safe, and it falls short in almost every measure that we can actually look at. So.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're gonna talk about application here. So, Dakarai, this is the part of our show where we talk about how this documentary and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work. We've been doing that a little bit throughout, but this is the official portion of where we do that. So, my application is that I think this kind of stuff, the conditions we see in these prisons, what's happening with corrections officers and incarcerated people, is happening everywhere across the United States. So toward the end of the documentary, Robert Earl says it's easy to justify doing a lot of bad things if the money is right. And I think that is what's happening everywhere. It's a representation of the kinds of things that happen everywhere. And I appreciate you, Dakarai, talking about we need to look at where's the money coming from? Who is it going to? Like, who are these contractors who are building the prisons? All of that. So, we mentioned that Alabama is spending millions every year to defend this prison system, which means states across the country are doing the same, because we know that these issues are not limited to Alabama. And we also know that cities are defending their police for similar violence, like your wrongful arrest, Dakarai. And so this is happening in different ways across the country. And so to recognize that, I think, is my kind of application from this isn't limited to Alabama. And I think Robert Earl says at the end of this that this stuff is happening in your state too. So that's my application. Dakarai, did you have anything specific that you were like, oh, this is the everyday work application that comes from this?
It was re-traumatizing for me because it's so easy to get pulled over and end up in the system. Yeah. And there was just a story 2 weeks ago of a young man that made a mistake, and he didn't even make it into a prison. It was a jailhouse, and ended up dead. And it was just a matter of moments before he was set to be released. So a very small traffic violation could send you to one of these facilities. And I want people to realize that this is not some foreign thing. Like, you could be sucked into this. And there's so many innocent people we find in these systems as well. Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of humanity. It's a matter of our values. Most of us here in Alabama profess to be Christian. So no, this is not supposed to be the Ritz-Carlton, but what we're seeing is completely inhumane, and very few crimes in the state should result in a death sentence or a lifetime sentence, frankly. And that's what we're seeing with the denial of parole.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think at some point somebody says more people are leaving in body bags than are being let out on parole. And just that itself is a mind-boggling sort of statement that is true.
Yeah, and a shocking sort of effect of this system. I appreciate both of your applications. I think they work really well together and in tandem. And for me, all of that corruption, that the inhumane treatment and conditions that you talked about, Dakarai, all of that to me means that we need abolition here, right? I mean, these systems aren't working. These systems are literally killing people in the state of Alabama. And as you mentioned, everywhere. This is happening everywhere. This corruption is happening everywhere, all the way to our federal level. And so for me, I hope that a film like this leads to sort of greater political education around what prison abolition is and could be and could mean for, a state like Alabama and all of us in all of our states, and what the possibilities are beyond what we currently have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great application all around. Let's talk about homework. So, Dakarai, this is the part of the show where we talk about what we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning work beyond our conversation today. So there was a class action lawsuit that was mentioned in the film that was filed in the wake of the strike that Robert Earl and Melvin planned across all of the prisons in Alabama, which was incredible. We didn't get a chance to talk about that. The organizing work, it's hard enough to organize people who aren't incarcerated. Organizing people who are incarcerated across the state of Alabama in 14 different institutions, so impressive. And so, just amazing work from them on that. But one of the things that happened in the wake of that is this class action lawsuit that was signed on by some major labor unions. And so I'd like to learn more about who has signed on, what compelled them to sign on to that, and sort of their reason behind that, just to see how labor unions are maybe, I think we've seen some more work from labor unions in recent years around pursuing more kind of the social justice agenda that it seems like they felt like they've had to leave behind in the wake of deindustrialization and the sort of neoliberal turn economically as we defund more things in favor of privatization. And so I'm interested to see, like, what have the labor unions done and how have they signed on to help this class action lawsuit or to support it, right? Yeah.
It's interesting, slightly different topic, but the use of prison labor in, for example, the Hyundai plant near Montgomery has suppressed local wages.
Yeah.
So this is, again, another way to think about application and how this is impacting you. You are paying for these folks to the tune of $60,000 a year for a typical incarcerated person to up to $100,000 for a senior citizen. That's your money. You're then paying $57 million to defend when they torture these folks, and now your wages are lower because you're competing with them in manufacturing jobs.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that is also really good homework for all of us to think about, like, and to look into in our various states, like where's our money going and how is this happening again in states across the country. I certainly don't know. This opened my eyes to think about what's happening here in Maryland. We should look into that and see what's going on here. But I think it's applicable for all of us to be thinking about, no matter where we live. And I also certainly want to continue to follow your campaign, Dakarai, and see the great work that you do and hopefully get elected to do to help the state of Alabama, because you've got some great ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank Dakarai for joining us. And also, do you have any closing thoughts or any last words or anything you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, well, check out the documentary and check out my website, DakaraiLarriett.com, and my plans for making a more just criminal justice system for all of us. One of the signature pieces that I've drafted is called the Motorist Bill of Rights, and that protects all of us when we're on the roads. We're so vulnerable when we are in our cars. You think about your Fourth Amendment rights are lessened. You, for example, in my case, don't necessarily get the evidence from that night.
Yeah.
It can be used against you. So I have a lot of ideas around disclosure, body cam, how we can get that uploaded to a third-party cloud whenever there's an incident, and have that shared with the principal so that there is accountability from those who are supposed to protect us. So check out my website, DakaraiLarriett.com. We'd love to hear from you. Get involved. We'll be looking for volunteers and folks who can support the campaign over the coming months.
Awesome.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for sharing your story with us, too. I know that that can be difficult. You talked about this was a little bit triggering for you, too, right? And so we appreciate you sharing that with us. And it is added texture and examples of why this is so important. And so thank you again for that and for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Well, Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yeah, so I'm going to bring two pieces from The Forge to the table for us to talk about next week. The first is called The Climate Movement Must Be a Movement Against Fascism by Aru Shiny-Ajay. And the second is called Solidarity is the Solution by Jeremiah Smith. And both of these pieces were actually published just earlier this month in The Forge's latest issue. That issue is titled Right to a Roof on Climate, Crises, and Care, which, I feel like I found out about that latest issue on social media a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to come back and check it out. And so the first piece that I named, the one by Aru, is the feature story of the issue. Okay. And its tagline is, "The era of holding our lane is over. We must now choose between building a single issue movement or preserving the democracy necessary for any movement to survive." And then the second piece, the Solidarity one, its tagline is, "The same public subsidies that fund Memphis's slumlords now bankroll Elon Musk's pollution, revealing a single profitable system that organizers are challenging by uniting the struggles for housing and environmental justice." And so that one obviously is using Memphis as a case study, but I think both pieces, hopefully in tandem, will give us an opportunity to talk about the need for solidarity and the fight for environmental justice and certainly our collective liberation. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, those sound incredible. I'm looking forward to reading those.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today, and thank Dakarai again for joining us. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating or review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube. Sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.